Book 2, Part 1, Section 2, The Pains and Consolations of Abandonment. The soul ought to strip itself of all things created in order to arrive at the state of abandonment. This state is full of consolation for those who have attained it, but to do so it is necessary to pass through much anguish. The doctrine concerning pure love can only be taught by the action of God and not by any effort of the mind. God teaches the soul by pains and obstacles, not by ideas. This science is a practical knowledge by which God is enjoyed as the only good. In order to master this science, it is necessary to be detached from all personal possessions, to gain this detachment, to be really deprived of them. Therefore, it is only by constant crosses and by a long succession of all kinds of mortifications, trials, and deprivations that pure love becomes established in the soul. This must continue until all things created become as though they did not exist, and God becomes all in all. To effect this, God combats all the personal affections of the soul, so that when these take any special shape, such as some pious notion, some help to devotion, or when there is any idea of being able to attain perfection by some such method, or such a path or way, or by the guidance of some particular person, in fine, to whatever the soul attaches itself, God upsets its plans and allows it to find, instead of success in these projects, nothing but confusion, trouble, emptiness, and folly. Hardly has it said, I must go this way, I must consult this person, or I must act in such a manner. Then God immediately says the exact contrary, and withdraws all the virtue usual in the means adopted by the soul. Thus, finding only deception and emptiness in everything, the soul is compelled to have recourse to God himself and to be content with him. Happy the soul that understands this lovingly severe conduct of God, and that corresponds faithfully with it. It is raised above all that passes away to repose in the immutable and the infinite. It is no longer dissipated among created things by giving them love and confidence, but allows them only when it becomes a duty to do so, or when enjoined by God, and when his will is made especially manifest in the matter. It inhabits a region above earthly abundance or dearth in the fullness of God, who is its permanent good. God finds this soul quite empty of its own inclinations, of its own movements, of its own choice. It is a dead subject, and shrouded in universal indifference. The whole of the divine being, coming thus to fill the heart, casts over all created things a shadow, as of nothingness, absorbing all their distinctions and all their varieties. Thus there remains neither efficacy nor virtue in anything created, and the heart is neither drawn towards, nor has any inclination for created things, because the majesty of God fills it to its utmost extent. Living in God, in this way the heart becomes dead to all else, and all is dead to it. It is for God, who gives life to all things, to revive the soul with regard to his creation, and to give a different aspect to all things in the eyes of the soul. It is the order of God which is this life. By this order the heart goes out towards the creature as far as is necessary or useful, and it is also by this order that the creature is carried towards the soul and is accepted by it. Without this divine virtue of the good pleasure of God, things created are not admitted by the soul. Neither is the soul at all inclined towards them. This dissolution of all things as far as the soul is concerned, and then, by the will of God, their being brought once more into existence, compels the soul at each moment to see God in all things, for each moment is spent for the sanctification of God only, and in an unreserved self-abandonment with regard to its relations to all possible created things, or rather to those created, or possibly to be created by the order of God. Therefore, each moment contains all. Book 2, Part 1, Section 3, The Different Duties of Abandonment. The active exercise of abandonment, either in relation to precept or to inspiration. Although souls called by God to a state of abandonment are much more passive than active, yet they cannot expect to be exempted from all activity. This state being nothing else but the virtue of abandonment, exercised more habitually and with greater perfection, should, like this virtue, be composed of two kinds of duty: the active accomplishment of the divine will, and the passive acceptance of all that this will pleases to send. It consists essentially, as we have already said, in the gift of our whole self to God, to be used as He thinks fit. Well, the good pleasure of God makes use of us in two ways. Either it compels us to perform certain actions, or it simply works within us. We, therefore, submit always in two ways, either by the faithful accomplishment of its clearly defined orders, or else by a simple and passive submission to its impressions of either pleasure or pain. Abandonment implies all this, being nothing else but a perfect submission to the order of God, as made manifest at the present moment. It matters little to the soul in what manner it is obliged to abandon itself, and what the present moment contains. All that is absolutely necessary is that it should abandon itself unreservedly. There are then prescribed duties to be fulfilled, and necessary duties to be accepted, and further, there is a third kind which also forms part of an active fidelity, although it does not properly belong to the works of precept. In this are comprised inspired duties, those to which the Spirit of God inclines the hearts that are submissive to Him. The accomplishment of this kind of duty requires a great simplicity, a gentle and cheerful heartiness, a soul easily moved by every breath of directing grace, for there is nothing else to do but to give oneself up, and to obey its inspirations simply and freely. So that souls may not be deceived, God never fails to give them wise guidance to indicate with what liberty or reserve these inspirations should be made use of. The third kind of duty takes precedence of all law, formalities, and marked-out rules. It is what, in saints, appears singular and extraordinary. It is what regulates their vocal prayer, interior words, the perception of their faculties, and also all that makes their lives noble, such as austerities, zeal, and the prodigality of their self-devotion for others. As all this belongs to the interior rule of the Holy Spirit, no one ought to try to obtain it, to imagine that they have it, to desire it, nor to regret that they do not possess the grace to undertake this kind of work, and to practice these uncommon virtues because they are only really meritorious when practiced according to the direction of God. If one is not content with this reserve, one lays oneself open to the influence of one's own ideas, and will become exposed to illusion. It is necessary to remark that there are souls that God keeps hidden and little in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. Far from giving them striking qualities, His design for them is that they should remain in obscurity. They would be deceived if they desired to attempt a different way. If they are well instructed, they will recognize that fidelity to their nothingness is their right path, and they will find peace in their lowliness. The only difference, therefore, in their way and that of, apparently, more favored souls, is the difference they make for themselves by the amount of their love and submission to the will of God. For if they surpass in these virtues the souls that appear to work more than they exteriorly, their sanctity is, without doubt, so much the greater. This shows that each soul ought to content itself with the duties of its state and the overruling of Providence. Clearly God exacts this equally from all. As to attraction and the impressions received by the soul, these are given by God alone, to whom He pleases. One must not try to produce them oneself, nor to make efforts to increase them. Natural effort is in direct opposition and quite contrary to infused inspirations, which should come in peace. The voice of the divine spouse will awaken the soul, which should only proceed according to the inspirations of the Holy Spirit. For if it were to act according to its own ideas, it would make no progress. Therefore, if it should feel neither attraction nor grace to do those things that make the saints so much admired, it must, in justice to itself, say, God has willed it thus for the saints, but not for Book 2, Part 1, Section 4. God does all for a soul of good will. The conduct of the soul raised to a state of abandonment with regard to this twofold manifestation of the good pleasure of God. Souls called by God to a life of perfect abandonment resemble in this respect our Lord, his Holy Mother, and Saint Joseph. The will of God was, to them, the fullness of life. Submitting entirely to this will as to precept and inspiration, directly it was made manifest to them. They were always in complete dependence on what we might call the purely providential will of God. From this it follows that their lives, although extraordinary in perfection, showed outwardly nothing that is not common to all and quite ordinary. They fulfilled the duties of religion and of their state as others do, and in apparently the same way. For the rest, if one scrutinizes their conduct, nothing can be discovered either striking or peculiar. All follows the same course of ordinary events. That which might single them out is not discernible. It is that dependence on the supreme will which arranges all things for them, and in which they habitually live. The divine will confers on them a complete self-mastery on account of the habitual submission of their hearts. Therefore, the souls in question are, by their state, both solitary and free, detached from all things in order to belong to God, to love Him in peace, and to fulfill faithfully the present duty according to His expressed will. They do not allow themselves to reflect, to neglect, nor to think of consequences, causes, or reasons. It is enough for them to go on simply, accomplishing their planned duties just as if they did not exist for them anything but their present obligation and their duty to God. The present moment, then, is like a desert in which the soul sees only God, whom it enjoys, and is only occupied about those things which He requires of it, leaving and forgetting all else, and abandoning it to Providence. This soul, like an instrument, neither receives interiorly more than the operation of God effects passively, nor gives exteriorly more than this same operation applies actively. This interior application is accompanied by a free and active cooperation, which is at the same time infused and mystical. That is to say, that God, finding in this soul all the necessary qualifications for acting according to His laws, and satisfied with its good will, spares it the trouble of doing so, by bestowing all that would otherwise be the fruit of its efforts, or of its effectual good will. It is as though someone, seeing a friend preparing for a troublesome journey, would go in his stead, so that the friend would have the intention of going, but he spared the trouble of the journey. Yet by this impersonation he would have gone himself, at least virtually. This journey would be free because it would be the result of a free determination taken beforehand to please the friend, who then takes upon himself the trouble and expense. It would also be active because it will be a real advance, and it will be interior because effected without outward activity. And finally, it will be mystical because of the hidden principle it contains. But to return to that kind of cooperation that we have explained by this imaginary journey, you will observe that it is entirely different from fidelity in the fulfillment of obligations. The work of fulfilling these is neither mystical nor infused, but free and active as commonly understood. Therefore, abandonment to the good pleasure of God contains activity as well as passivity. In it there is nothing of self, but an habitual general good will, which, like an instrument, has no action of itself, but responds to the touch of the master. While in His hands it fulfills all the purposes for which it was formed. Intentional and determined obedience to the will of God is, in the ordinary order of vigilance, care, attention, prudence, and discretion, although ordinary efforts are sensibly aided or begun by grace. Leaving God, then, to act for all the rest, reserve for yourself at the present moment only love and obedience, which virtues the soul will practice eternally. This love, infused into the soul in silence, is a real action of which it makes a perpetual obligation. It ought, in fact, to preserve it faithfully, and to maintain itself constantly in those dispositions resulting from it, all of which, as is evident, cannot be done without action. The action, however, is quite different to obedience to the present duty, by which the soul so disposes its faculties as to fulfill perfectly the will of God, made manifest to it exteriorly, without expecting anything extraordinary. This divine will is to the soul in all things its method, its rule, and its direct and safe way. It is an unalterable law which is of all times, of all places, and of all states. It is a straight line which the soul must follow with courage and fidelity, neither diverging to the right nor to the left, or overstepping the bounds. Whatever is over and above must be received passively as it carries on its work in abandonment. In a word, the soul is active in all that the present duty requires, but passive and submissive in all the rest, about which there should be no self-will, but patient waiting for the divine motion. Abandonment to Divine Providence, Book 2, Part 1, Section 5, The Common Way of All Souls. The soul that aims at union with God should value all the operations of His grace, but should only attach itself to that of the present moment. It is by union with the will of God that we enjoy and possess Him, and it is an illusion to endeavor to obtain this divine enjoyment by any other means. Union with the will of God is the universal means. It does not act by one method only, but by all methods, and always are, by its virtue, sanctified. The divine will unites God to our souls in many different ways, and that which suits us is always best for us. Always should be esteemed and loved, because in each we should behold that which is ordained by God accommodating itself to each individual soul, and selecting the most suitable method of effecting it by the divine union. The duty of the soul is to submit to this choice and to make none for itself, and this without dispensing itself from esteeming and loving this adorable will and its work in others. For instance, if this divine will should prevent me saying vocal prayers, having sensible devotion, or receiving lights on mysteries, I should still love and esteem the silence and bareness induced by the sight of the faith of others, while for myself I should make use of the present moment, and by it should become united to God. I should not, as the Quietists do, reduce all religion to personal inaction, despising all other means, because what makes perfection is obedience to the law of God, which always renders the means it applies suitable to the soul. No, I should not admit of obstacles or bounds to the will of God. Neither should I take anything in place of it, but should welcome it in whatever way it was made manifest to me, and should revere it in whatever way it was pleased to unite itself to others. Thus all ordinary souls have but one common way in which each is distinct and different, in order to form the variety of the mystical robe of the Church. All these souls mutually approve of and esteem each other, and all say, we are going to the same goal by different paths, and are all united in the same way and by the same means in the ordinance of God, which is so different in each. It is in this sense that we must read the lives of the saints and other spiritual books, without ever making a change and forsaking our own path. For this reason it is necessary that we should neither read spiritual books nor hold spiritual conversation, unless God so wills. For if He make it the duty of the present moment, the soul, far from making any change, will be strengthened in its way, either by what it finds in conformity with its own method, or even by that in which it differs. But if the will of God does not make this reading or spiritual intercourse a present duty, it will cause nothing but trouble, and a confusion of ideas, and a succession of changes will ensue, because without the concurrence of God's will, there cannot be order in anything. Since when, therefore, have we busied ourselves with the pains and anxieties of our souls, which have nothing to do with our present duty? When will God be all in all to us? Let creatures act according to their nature, but let nothing hinder us. Let us go beyond all created things and live entirely for God. Abandonment to Divine Providence, Book 2, Part 1, Section 6, The Duty of the Present Moment, the Only Rule. From souls in this state, God exacts the most perfect docility to the action of His grace. It is necessary to be detached from all that one feels, and from all that one does, to follow this method, by which one subsists in God alone and in the present duty. All regard to what is beyond this should be cut off as superfluous. One must restrict oneself to the present duty, without thinking of the preceding one, or of the one which is to follow. I imagine the law of God to be always before you, and that the practice of abandonment has rendered your soul docile to the divine action. You feel some impulse that makes you say, I have a drawing towards this person, or I have an inclination to read a certain book, to receive or to give certain advice, to complain of certain things, to open my mind to another, or to receive confidence, to give away something, or to perform some action. Well, obey this impulse according to the inspiration of grace without stopping to reflect, to reason, or to make effort. Give yourself up to these things for as long as God wishes, without doing so through any self-will. In the state in question, the will of God is shown to us because He dwells within us. This will ought to supplant all our usual supports. At each moment we have practiced some virtue. To this the obedient soul is faithful. Nothing of what it has learnt by reading or hearing is forgotten, and the most mortified novice could not fulfill her duties better. It is for this that these souls are attracted sometimes to one book, sometimes to another, or else to make some remark, some reflection on what may seem but a trifling circumstance. At one time God gives them the attraction to learn something that at some future time will encourage them in the practice of virtue. Whatever these souls do, they do because they feel an attraction for it, without knowing why. All they can explain on the subject can be reduced to this: I feel myself drawn to write, to read, to ask, to examine this. I follow this attraction, and God, who gives it to me, keeps these particular things in reserve in my faculties to become in future the nucleus of other attractions which will become useful to myself and others. This is what makes it necessary for these souls to be simple, gentle, yielding, and submissive to the faintest breath of these scarcely perceptible impressions. In the state of abandonment, the only rule is the duty of the present moment. In this the soul is light as a feather, liquid as water, simple as a child, active as a ball in receiving and following all the inspirations of grace. Such souls have no more consistence and rigidity than molten metal. As this takes any form according to the mold into which it is poured, so these souls are pliant and easily receptive of any form that God chooses to give them. In a word, their disposition resembles the atmosphere, which is affected by every breeze, or water which flows into any shaped vessel, exactly filling every crevice. They are before God like a perfectly woven fabric with a clear surface, and neither think nor seek to know what God will be pleased to trace thereon. Because they have confidence in Him, they abandon themselves to Him, and, entirely absorbed by their duty, they think not of themselves, nor of what may be necessary for them, nor of how to obtain it. The more assiduously do they apply themselves to their little work, so simple, so hidden, so secret, and outwardly contemptible, the more does God embroider and embellish it with brilliant colors. On the surface of this simple canvas of love and obedience, His hand traces the most beautiful design, the most delicate and intricate pattern, the most divine figures. Verificavit Dominus sanctum suum. The Lord hath made His Holy One wonderful. Psalms 4. It is true that a canvas simply and blindly given up to the work of the pencil only feels its movement at each moment. Each blow of the hammer on the chisel can only produce one cruel mark at a time, and the stone struck by repeated blows cannot know nor see the form produced by them. It only feels that it is being diminished, filed, cut, and altered by the chisel. And a stone that is destined to become a crucifix or a statue, without knowing it, if it were asked, "What is happening to you?" would reply, if it could speak, "Do not ask me. I only know one thing, and that is to remain immovable in the hands of my Master, to love Him, and to endure all that He inflicts upon me. As for the end for which I am destined, it is His business to understand how it is to be accomplished. I am as ignorant of what He is doing as of what I am destined to become. All I know is that His work is the best and the most perfect that could be, and I receive each blow of the chisel as the most excellent thing that could happen to me. Although, truth to tell, each blow, in my opinion, causes the idea of ruin, destruction, and disfigurement. But that is not my affair. Content with the present moment, I think of nothing but my duty, and I endure the work of this clever master without knowing or occupying myself about it. Yes, give to God what belongs to Him, and remain lovingly passive in His hands, Hold for certain that what takes place either exteriorly or interiorly is best for you. Allow God to act and abandon yourself to Him. Let the chisel perform its office, the needle do its work. Let the brush of the artist cover the canvas with many tints which only have the appearance of daubs. Correspond with all these divine operations by a simple and constant submission, a forgetfulness of self, and an assiduous application to duty. Continue thus in your own groove without studying the way, the ins and outs and surroundings, the names or particulars of the places. Go on blindly pursuing this path, and you will be shown what is to follow. Seek only the kingdom of God and His justice by love and obedience, and all the rest will be added to you. We meet with many souls who are distressed about themselves and inquire anxiously, who will direct us so that we may become mortified and holy and attain perfection? Let them search in books for the description and characteristics of this marvelous work, its nature and qualities. But as for you, do you remain peacefully united to God by love, and follow blindly the clear, straight path of duty? The angels are at your side during this time of darkness, and they will bear you up. If God requires more of you, He will make it known to you by His inspirations. Book 2, Part 1, Section 7. Trust in the guidance of God. The docile soul will not seek to learn by what road God is conducting it. When God makes Himself the guide of a soul, He exacts from it an absolute confidence in Him and a freedom from any sort of disquietude as to the way in which He conducts it. This soul, therefore, is urged on without perceiving the path traced out before it. It does not imitate either what it has seen or what it has read, but proceeds by its own action and cannot do otherwise without grave risk. The divine action is ever fresh. It never retraces its steps, but always marks out new ways. Souls that are conducted by it never know where they are going. Their ways are neither to be found in books nor in their own minds. The divine action carries them step by step, and they progress only according to its movement. When you are conducted by a guide who takes you through an unknown country at night, across fields where there are no tracks, by his own skill, without asking advice from anyone, or giving you any inkling of his plans, how can you choose but abandon yourself? Of what use is it looking about to find out where you are, to ask the passerbys, or to consult maps and travelers? Plans or fancies of a guide who insists on being trusted would not allow of this. He would take pleasure in overcoming the anxiety and distrust of the soul, and would insist on an entire surrender to his guidance. If one is convinced that he is a good guide, one must have faith in him, and abandon oneself to his care. The divine action is essentially good. It does not need to be reformed or controlled. It began at the creation of the world, and to the present time has manifested ever-fresh energy. Its operations are without limit, its fecundity inexhaustible. It acted in one way yesterday. Today it acts differently. It is the same action applied at each moment to produce ever new effects, and it will extend from eternity to eternity. It has produced Abel, Noah, Abraham, all different types, Isaac, also original, and Jacob from no copy. Neither does Joseph follow any prefigure. Moses has no prototype among his progenitors. David and the prophets are quite apart from the patriarchs. St. John the Baptist stands alone. Jesus Christ is the firstborn. The apostles act more by the guidance of his Spirit than in imitation of his works. Jesus Christ did not set a limit for himself, neither did he follow all his own maxims to the letter. The Holy Spirit ever inspired his holy soul, and, being entirely abandoned to its every breath, it had no need to consult the moment that had passed, to know how to act in that which was coming. The breath of grace shaped every moment according to the eternal truth subsisting in the invisible and unfathomable wisdom of the Blessed Trinity. The soul of Jesus Christ received these directions at every moment and acted upon them externally. The Gospel shows in the life of Jesus Christ a succession of these truths, and this same Jesus, who lives and works always, continues to live and work in the souls of his saints. If you would live according to the Gospel, abandon yourself simply and entirely to the action of God. Jesus Christ is its supreme mouthpiece, He was yesterday, is today, and will be forever. Hebrews 13:8. Continuing, not commencing his life. What he has done is finished. What remains to be done is being carried on at every moment. Each saint receives a share in this divine life, and in each, Jesus Christ is different, although the same in himself. The life of each saint is the life of Jesus Christ. It is a new gospel. The cheeks of the spouse are compared to beds of flowers, to gardens filled with fragrant blossoms. The divine action is the gardener, admirably arranging the flower beds. This garden resembles no other, for among all the flowers there are no two alike, or that can be described as being of the same species, except in the fidelity with which they respond to the action of the Creator, in leaving Him free to do as He pleases, and, on their side, obeying the laws imposed on them by their nature. Let God act, and let us do what He requires of us. This is the gospel. This is the general scripture and the common law. Book 2, Part 1, Chapter 3, The Trials Connected with the State of Abandonment. Section 1, Unwise Interference. The first trial, the obloquy and unreasonable exaction of persons with a reputation for wisdom and piety. There is no way more secure than that of abandonment, and none more easy, sweet, clear, and less subject to illusion and error. In it God is loved, and all Christian duties fulfilled. The sacraments are frequented, and all the exterior acts of religion, which are binding to all, are performed. Superiors are obeyed, and the duties of the state of life are discharged. Temptations of the flesh, the world, and the devil are continually resisted, for none are more on guard or more vigilant in acquitting themselves of all their obligations than those who follow this way. If this is the case, why is it that they should be subject to so many contradictions? The most usual of these is that when they, like other Christians, have accomplished all that the most strict theologian could exact, they are expected also to be bound to inconvenient practices to which the Church by no means obliges them, and if they do not comply, they are charged with laboring under illusion. But I ask, can a Christian who confines himself to the observance of God's commandments and those of the Church, and who, besides, without practicing meditation, contemplation, or spiritual reading, and without being attached to any particular form of devotion, yet attends to worldly business and to other affairs of private life, can he be wrong? One cannot presume to accuse or even to suspect him of error. One must admit this to oneself, and while leaving the Christian of whom I am speaking in peace, it is but justice not to trouble a soul that not only fulfills the precepts at least as well as one does oneself, but whom, in addition, practice exterior acts of piety that are even unknown to others, or, if known, are treated with indifference. Prejudice goes so far as to affirm that this soul deceives itself and deludes itself because, after having submitted to all that the Church prescribes, it holds itself free to be in the condition to give itself without hindrance to the interior operations of God, and to attend to the impressions of His grace at times when no other duty intervenes to expressly compel them. In a word, they are condemned because they employ that time which others give to amusements and temporal affairs in loving God. Is not this a crying injustice? This cannot be too strongly insisted upon. If anyone keeps the ordinary course, goes to confession once a year, nothing is said about it. He is left in peace with an occasional injunction, not pressed with too much importunity, nor making it an obligation to do a little more. If he should change his ways and try to improve them, then he is overwhelmed with counsels for his conduct, and with different methods. And if he does not follow these pious rules diligently, then he is done for. He is a subject of suspicion, and nothing is too bad to predict of him. Are they not aware that these practices, however good and holy they may be, are, after all, only a way leading to divine union? Is it necessary, then, to be always on the road when one has already arrived at the goal? Nevertheless, it is this that is exacted of a soul which is supposed to be laboring under illusion. This soul has made its way, like others, at the beginning. Like them, it knew what to do and did it faithfully. it would be vain now to attempt to keep it bound to the same practices. Since God, moved by the efforts it has made to advance with these helps, has taken it on himself to lead it to this happy union, from the time it arrived at the state of abandonment, and by love possessed God, in fine, from the time that the God of all goodness, relieving it of all its troubles and industry, made himself the principle of its operations, these first methods lost all their value and were but the road it had traversed. To insist upon these methods being resumed and constantly followed would be to make the soul forsake the end at which it had arrived to re-enter the way which led to it. But if this soul has any experience, their time and trouble will be thrown away. In vain will they pursue it with noisy clamors. Turning a deaf ear, it will remain untroubled and unmoved in that intimate peace in which it so advantageously exercises its love. This is the center in which it reposes, or, if you prefer it, it is the straight line traced by the hand of God. It will continue to walk therein, for all its duties are plainly marked out in it, and by following this line, it fulfills them without confusion or haste as they present themselves. For all else, it holds itself in perfect liberty, always ready to obey every movement of grace directly it perceives it, and to abandon itself to the care of Providence. God makes known to this soul that he intends to be its master, and to direct it by his grace, and make it understand that it cannot, without attacking the sovereign rights of its Creator, allow its own liberty to be fettered. It feels that, if it tied itself down to the rules of those who live by their own efforts and industry, instead of acting according to the detraction of grace, it would be deprived of many things necessary in order to be able to fulfill future duties. But, as no one knows this, it is judged and condemned for its simplicity, and, though it does not find fault with others, but approves of every state, and well knows how to discern every degree of progress, it is despised by pretended wiseacres who cannot appreciate this sweet and hearty submission to Divine Providence. Worldly wisdom cannot understand the perpetual wanderings of the apostles, who did not settle anywhere. Ordinary spirituality also cannot endure that souls should depend for their action on Divine Providence. There are but few in this state who approve of them, but God, who instructs men by means of their fellow creatures, never fails to make such souls encounter those who abandon themselves to him with simplicity and fidelity. Besides, these latter require less direction than others, in consequence of having attained to this state with the help of very good directors. If they find that they are occasionally left to themselves, it is because Divine Providence removes by death, or banishes by some event, the guides who have led them in this way. Even then, they are always willing to be guided, and only wait in peace the moment arranged by Providence. During the time of privation, also, they meet from time to time persons in whom they feel they can repose a confidence inspired by God, although they know nothing about them. This is a sign that he makes use of them to communicate certain lights, even if these are only temporary. These souls ask advice, therefore, and when it is given, they follow it with the greatest docility. In default of such assistance, however, they have recourse to the maxims supplied to them by their first directors. Thus, they are always very well directed, either by the old principles formerly received, or by the advice of those directors they encounter, and they make use of all until God sends them persons in whom they can confide, and who will show them his will. Book 2, Part 1, Section 2, Unjust Judgments. Second trial of the state of abandonment. The apparent uselessness and exterior defects allowed by God in the souls he wills to raise to this state. The second trial of souls conducted by God in this way is the result of their apparent uselessness and of their exterior defects. There can be neither honor nor reward in a service hidden often enough under the most utter incapacity and uselessness. As far as the world is concerned, doubtless those who are given more important posts are not on this account necessarily precluded from the state of abandonment. Less still is this state incompatible with striking virtue and that sanctity which attracts universal veneration. Nevertheless, There is a far greater number of souls raised to this sublime state, whose virtue is known only to God. By their state, these souls are free from nearly every outward obligation. They are little suited for worldly business or affairs, for complicated concerns, or for putting their mind into the conducting of industries. It seems as though they were quite useless. Nothing is noticeable in them but feebleness of body, mind, imagination, and passion. They take no notice of anything. They are, so to say, quite stupid, and possess nothing of that culture, study, or reflection which go to the making of a man. They are like children of nature before they are placed in the hands of masters to be formed. They have noticeable faults which, without rendering them more guilty than children, cause more offense. God takes away everything but innocence in order that they should have nothing to rely upon but Him alone. The world, being in ignorance of this mystery, can only judge by appearance, and can find nothing in them to its taste, nor anything that it values. It therefore rejects and despises them, and they seem to be exposed to censure from all. The more closely they are observed, the less is thought of them, and the more opposition do they encounter. No one knows what to make of them. Although some hidden voice seems to speak in their favor, yet people prefer to adhere to their own malignant prepossessions rather than to follow this instinct, or at least to suspend their judgment. Their actions are pried into to find out their opinions, and like the Pharisees, who could not endure the actions of Jesus, they are regarded with such prejudice that everything they do appears either ridiculous or criminal. Section 3. Self-Contempt. The third trial, interior humiliations. Contemptible as they are in the eyes of others, the souls raised by God to this state are far more contemptible in their own. There is nothing either in what they do or in what they suffer that is not altogether paltry and humiliating. There is nothing striking in anything about them. All is quite ordinary. Nothing but troubles and afflictions interiorly, and contradictions and disappointments exteriorly. With a feeble body requiring many alleviations and comforts, the very reverse, one would think of that spirit of poverty and austerity so much admired in the saints. Neither heroic undertakings nor fasts, large alms, nor ardent and far-reaching zeal can be discerned in them. But, united to God by faith and love, they behold in themselves nothing but disorder. They despise themselves still more by comparison with those who pass for saints, and who, besides adapting themselves with facility to rules and methods, show nothing irregular either in their persons or actions. Therefore, their own shortcomings in this respect fill them with confusion and are unbearable to them. It is on this account that they give way to sighs and tears, marking the grief with which they are oppressed. Let us remember that Jesus Christ was both God and man. As man, He was destroyed, and as God, He remained full of glory. These souls have no participation in His glory, but they share in the sadness and misery of His sufferings. Men regard them in the same way as Herod and his court regarded Jesus Christ. These poor souls, therefore, are nourished as to their senses and mind with the most disgusting food, in which they can find no pleasure. They aspire to something quite different, but all the avenues leading to the sanctity they so much desire remain closed to them. They must live on this bread of suffering, on this bread mingled with ashes, with a continual shrinking, both exterior and interior. They have formed an idea of saintliness which gives them constant and irremediable torment. The will hungers for it, but is powerless to practice it. Why should this be, except to mortify the soul in that which is its most spiritual and intimate part, which, finding no satisfaction or pleasure in anything that happens to it, must needs place all its affection in God, who conducts it this way for the express purpose of preventing it taking pleasure in anything but Him alone. It seems to me that it is easy to conclude from all this that souls abandoned to God cannot occupy themselves, as others do, with desires, examinations, cares, or attachments to certain persons. Neither can they form plans, nor lay down methodical rules for their actions, or for reading. This would imply that they still had power to dispose of themselves, which would entirely exclude the state of abandonment in which they are placed. In this state they give up to God all their rights over themselves, over their words, actions, thoughts, and proceedings, over the employment of their time and everything connected with it. There remains only one desire, to satisfy the master they have chosen, to listen unceasingly to the expression of his will, in order to execute it immediately. No condition can better represent this state than that of a servant who obeys every order he receives, and does not occupy his time in attending to his own affairs. These he neglects in order to serve his master at every moment. These souls, then, should not be distressed at their powerlessness. They are able to do much in being able to give themselves entirely to a master who is all-powerful and able to work wonders with the feeblest of instruments if they offer no resistance. Let us, then, endure without annoyance the humiliations entailed on us in our own eyes and in the eyes of others, by what shows outwardly in our lives, or rather let us conceal ourselves behind these outward appearances, and enjoy God, who is all ours. Let us profit by this apparent failure, by these requirements, by this caretaking, and the necessity of constant nourishment and of comfort, of our ill success, of the contempt of others, of these fears, uncertainties, troubles, etc., to find all our wealth and happiness in God, who by these means gives himself entirely to us as our only good. God wishes to be ours in a poor way, without all those accessories of sanctity which makes others to be admired. And this is because God would have himself to be the sole food of our souls, the only object of our desires. We are so weak that if we displayed the virtues of zeal, almsgiving, poverty, and austerity, we should make them subjects for vainglory. But as it is, everything is disagreeable, in order that God may be our whole sanctification, our whole support, so that the world despises us and leaves us to enjoy our treasure in peace. God desires to be the principle of all that is holy in us, and therefore what depends on ourselves and on our active fidelity is very small, and appears quite contrary to sanctity. There cannot be anything great in us in the sight of God except our passive endurance. Therefore let us think of it no more. Let us leave the care of our sanctification to God, who well knows how to effect it. It all depends on the watchful care and particular operation of Divine Providence, and is accomplished in a great measure without our knowledge, and even in a way that is unexpected and disagreeable to us. Let us fulfill peacefully the little duties of our active fidelity, without aspiring to those that are greater, because God does not give himself to us by reason of our own efforts. We shall become saints of God, of his grace, and of his special providence. He knows what rank to give us. Let us leave it to him, and without forming to ourselves false ideas and empty systems of sanctity, let us content ourselves with loving him unceasingly, and in pursuing with simplicity the path he has marked out for us, where all is so mean and paltry in our eyes, and in the estimation of the world. Section 4. Distrust of self. The fourth trial of souls in the state of abandonment. The obscurity of their state, and their apparent opposition to the will of God. For a soul that desires nothing else but the will of God, what could be more miserable than the impossibility of being certain of loving him? Formerly it was mentally enlightened to perceive in what consisted the plan for its perfection, but it is no longer able to do so in its present state. Perfection is given to it contrary to all preconceived ideas, to all light, to all feeling. It is given by all the crosses sent by Providence, by the action of present duties, by certain attractions, which have in them no good beyond that of not leading to sin, but seem very far from the dazzling sublimity of sanctity and all that is unusual in virtue. God and his grace are given in a hidden and strange manner, for the soul feels too weak to bear the weight of its crosses, and disgusted with its obligations. Its attractions are only for quite ordinary exercises. The ideal it has formed of sanctity reproaches it interiorly for its mean and contemptible disposition. All books treating of the lives of the saints condemn it. It can find nothing in vindication of its conduct. It beholds a brilliant sanctity which renders it disconsolate because it has not strength sufficient to attain to it, and it does not see that its weakness is divinely ordered, but looks upon it as cowardice. Those whom it knows to be distinguished for striking virtue of sublime contemplation regard it only with contempt. What a strange saint, they say, and the soul, believing this and confused by its countless useless efforts to raise itself from this low condition, is overwhelmed with opprobrium. and has nothing to advance in its own favor either to itself or to others. The soul in this state feels as if it were lost. Its reflections afford it no help for its guidance or enlightenment, and divine grace seems to have failed it. It is, however, through this loss that it finds again that some grace substituted under a different form and restoring 100-fold more than it took away by the purity of its hidden impressions. This is without doubt a death blow to the soul, for it loses sight of the divine will, which, so to speak, withdraws itself from observation to stand behind it and push it on, becoming thus its invisible principle and no longer its clearly defined object. Experience proves that nothing kindles the desire more than this apparent loss. Therefore the soul vehemently desires to be united to the divine will, and gives vent to the most profound sighs, finding no possible consolation anywhere. A heart that has no other wish but to possess God must attract him to itself, and this secret of love is a very great one, since by this way alone are established in the soul sure faith and firm hope. It is then that we believe what we cannot see, and expect to possess what we cannot feel. Oh, how much does this incomprehensible conduct of an action, of which one is both subject and instrument, tend to one's perfection without any visible sign of appearance. Everything that one does seems done by chance or natural inclination, and is very humiliating to the soul. When inspired to speak, it seems as if one spoke only from oneself. One never sees by what spirit one is impelled. The most divine inspiration is a terror, and whatever one does or feels is a source of constant self-contempt, as though it were all faulty and imperfect. Others are always admired, and one feels very inferior to them, while their whole way of acting causes confusion. The soul distrusts its own judgment, and cannot be certain about any of its thoughts. It pays excessive submission to the least advice given by a respectable authority, and the divine action in thus keeping it apart from striking virtue seems to plunge it into deeper humiliation. This humiliation has no appearance of virtue to the soul. According to its own idea, it is pure justice. The most admirable thing about it is that in the eyes of others whom God does not enlighten, and even in its own eyes, the soul appears actuated by feelings absolutely contrary to virtue, such as pure obstinacy, disobedience, troublesomeness, contempt, and indignation, for which there seems no remedy. The more earnestly the soul strives to overcome these defects, the more do they increase, because they form part of the design of God as being the most suitable means of detaching the soul from itself to prepare it for the divine union. It is from this sad trial that the principal merit of the state of abandonment is gained. Now all is of a nature to withdraw the soul from its narrow path of love and simple obedience, and it requires heroic virtue and courage to keep firm in plain, active fidelity, and to sing its part in a song that seems to express in its tones that the soul is mistaken and lost, while grace sings a second. It does not hear this, however, and if it has courage to let the thunder roll, the lightning flash, and the tempest roar, and to walk with a firm tread in the path of love and obedience, of duty, and of the present attraction, it can be compared to the soul of Jesus during his passion, when our divine Savior walked steadfastly in the fulfilling of the will of his Father, and in his love, which imposed upon him a task apparently quite inconsistent with the dignity of a soul of such sanctity as his. The hearts of Jesus and Mary, bearing the fury of that darkest of nights, let the clouds gather and the storm rage. A multitude of things in appearance most opposed to the designs of God and of his order overwhelmed their faculties, but though deprived of all sensible support, they walked without faltering in the path of love and obedience. Their eyes were fixed only on what they had to do, and leaving God to act as he pleased with all that concerned them, they endured the whole weight of that divine action. They groaned under the burden, but not for a single instant did they waver or pause. They believed that all would be well, provided that they kept on their way and let God act. Book 2, Part 1, Section 5, The Life of Faith. The fruit of these trials, the conduct of the submissive soul. It results from all that has just been described that in the path of pure faith, all that takes place spiritually, physically, and temporarily has the aspect of death. This is not to be wondered at. What else could be expected? It is natural to this state. God has his plans for souls, and under this disguise he carries them out very successfully. Under the name of disguise, I include all ill success, corporal infirmities, and spiritual weakness. All succeeds and turns to good in the hands of God. It is by those things that are a trouble to nature that he prepares for the accomplishment of his greatest designs. Omnia cooperantur in bonum ius qui secundum propositum vocati sunt sanctae. All things work together unto good to such as according to his purpose are called to be saints. Romans 8:28. He brings life out of the shadow of death, and therefore when nature is afraid, faith, which takes everything in a good sense, is full of courage and confidence. To live by faith is to live by joy, confidence, and certainty about all that has to be done or suffered at each moment, according to the designs of God. It is in order to animate and to maintain this life of faith that God allows the soul to be plunged into and carried away by the rough waters of so many pains, troubles, difficulties, fatigues, and overthrows. For it requires faith to find God in all these things. The divine life is given at every moment in a hidden but very sure manner, under different appearances, such as the death of the body, the supposed loss of the soul, and the confusion of all earthly affairs. In all these things, faith finds its food and support. It pierces through all and clings to the hand of God, the giver of life. Through all that does not partake of the nature of sin, the faithful soul should proceed with confidence, taking it all as a veil or disguise of God, whose immediate presence alarms and at the same time reassures the faculties of the soul. In fact, this great God, who consoles the humble, gives the soul, in the midst of its greatest desolation, an interior assurance that has nothing to fear, provided it allows him to act and abandons itself entirely to him. It is grieved because it has lost its well-beloved, and yet something assures it that it possesses him. It is troubled and disturbed, yet nevertheless has in its depths, I know not what, important grounds for attaching itself steadfastly to God. Truly, said Jacob, God is in this place, and I knew it not. Genesis 28:16. You seek God, and he is everywhere. Everything proclaims him. Everything gives him to you. He walks by your side, is around you and within you. There he lives, and yet you seek him. You seek your own idea of God, while all the time you possess him substantially. You seek perfection, and it is in everything that presents itself to you. Your sufferings, your actions, your attractions are the species under which God gives himself to you, while you are vainly striving after sublime ideas, which he by no means assumes, in order to dwell in you. Martha tried to please Jesus by cooking nice dishes, but Mary was content to be with Jesus in any way that he wished to give himself to her. But when Mary sought him in the garden according to the idea she had formed of him, he eluded her by presenting himself in the form of a gardener. The apostles saw Jesus, but mistook him for a phantom. God disguises himself, therefore, to raise the soul to the state of pure faith, to teach it to find him under every kind of appearance. For when it has discovered this secret of God, it is in vain for him to disguise himself. It says, he is there behind the wall. He is looking through the lattice, looking from the windows. Canticles 2:9. Oh, divine love, hide yourself, proceed from one trial to another, bind by attractions, blend, confuse, or break like threads all the ideas and methods of the soul. May it stray hither and thither for want of light, and be unable to see or understand in what path it should walk. Formerly it found you dwelling in your ordinary guise, in the peaceful response of solitude and prayer, or in suffering, even in the consolations you give to others, in the course of conversation, or in business. But now, after having tried every method known to please you, it has to stand aside, not seeing you in any of these things, as in former times. May the uselessness of its efforts teach it to seek you henceforth in yourself, which means to seek you everywhere, in all things, without distinction and without reflection. For, O divine love, what a mistake it is not to find you in all that is good and in every creature. Why then seek you in any other way than that by which you desire to give yourself? Why, divine love, seek you under any other species than those which you have chosen for your sacraments? The less there is to be seen or felt, so much the more scope for faith and obedience. Do you not give fecundity to the root hidden underground? And can you not, if you so will, make this darkness in which you are pleased to keep me fruitful? Live then, little root of my heart, in the deep, invisible heart of God, and by its power send forth branches, leaves, flowers, and fruits, which, although invisible to yourself, are a pure joy and nourishment to others. Without consulting your own tastes, give of your shade, flowers, and fruit to others. May all that is grafted on you receive that indeterminate sap, which will be known only by the growth and appearance of those same grafts. Become all to all, that as to yourself remain abandoned and indifferent. Remain in the dark and narrow prison of your miserable cocoon, little worm, until the warmth of grace forms you and sets you free. Then feed upon whatever leaves it offers you, and do not regret in the activity of abandonment the peace you have lost. Stop directly the divine action would have you stop, and be content to lose in the alternations of repose and activity, in incomprehensible changes, all your old formulas, methods, and ways, to take upon you those designed for you by the divine action. Thus you will spin your silk in secret, doing what you can neither see nor feel. You will condemn in yourself a secret envy of your companions, who are apparently dead and motionless, because they have not yet arrived at the point that you have attained. You continue to admire them, although you have surpassed them. May your affliction and your abandonment continue while you spin a silk in which the princes of the church and of the world and all sorts of souls will glory to be attired. After that, what will you become of you, little worm? By what outlet will you come forth? Oh, marvel of grace by which souls are molded in so many different shapes! Who can guess in what direction grace will guide it? And who could guess either what nature does with a silkworm if he had not seen it working? It is only necessary to provide it with leaves, and nature does the rest. Therefore no soul can tell from whence it came, nor whither it is going, neither from what thought of God the divine wisdom drew it, nor to what end it tends. Nothing is left but an entire passive abandonment, and to allow this divine wisdom to act without interfering by our own reflections, examples, and methods. We must act when the time to act comes, and cease when it is time to stop. If necessary, letting all be lost, and thus acting or remaining passive according to attraction and abandonment, we insensibly do or leave undone, without knowing what will be the result, and after many changes the formed soul receives wings and flies up to heaven, leaving a plentiful harvest on earth for other souls to gather. Chapter 4. Concerning the assistance rendered by the fatherly providence of God to those souls who have abandoned themselves to Him. Section 1. Confidence in God. The less the soul in the state of abandonment feels the help it receives from God, the more efficaciously does He sustain it. There is a kind of sanctity in which all the communications of God are luminous and distinct, but in the passive state of pure faith, all that God communicates partakes of the nature of that inaccessible darkness that surrounds His throne, and all ideas are confused and indistinct. The soul in this state of obscurity is often afraid, like the prophet, of running headlong against a rock. Fear not, faithful soul, for this is your right path, and the way by which God conducts you. There is no way more safe and sure than this dark way of faith. But it is so dark that I cannot tell you which way to go. Go wherever you please. You cannot lose the way where there is no path. Every way looks the same in the dark. You cannot see the end because nothing is visible. But I am afraid of everything. I feel as if at any moment I might fall over a precipice. Everything is an affliction to me. I well know that I am acting according to abandonment, but it seems to me that there are things I cannot do without acting contrary to virtue. I seem to be so far from all the virtues. The more I wish to practice them, the more remote they seem. I love virtue, but the obscure impressions by which I am attracted seem to keep virtue far from me. I always give in to this attraction, and although I cannot perceive that it guides me well, I cannot help following it. The spirit seeks light, but the heart is in darkness. Enlightened persons and those with lucid minds are congenial to my spirit. But when I hear conversations and listen to discourses, my heart understands nothing. Its whole state and way is simply an impression of the gift of faith which makes it love and appreciate those principles, truths, and paths wherein the spirit has neither object nor idea, and in which it trembles, shudders, and falters. I have an assurance, I do not know how, in the depths of my heart, that this way is right, not by the evidence of my senses, but by a feeling inspired by faith. This is because it is impossible for God to lead a soul without persuading it that the path is a right one, and this with a certainty all the greater the less it is perceived. And this certainty is victorious over all censures, fears, efforts, and all imaginations. The mind vainly cries out and seeks some better way. The bride recognizes the bridegroom unconsciously, but when she stretches out her hand to hold him, he disappears. She understands that the spouse to whom she belongs has rights over her, and she prefers to wander without order or method in abandoning herself to his guidance rather than to endeavor to gain confidence by following the beaten tracks of virtue. Let us go to God, then, my soul, in abandonment, and let us acknowledge that we are incapable of acquiring virtue by our own industry or effort. But let us not allow this absence of particular virtues to diminish our confidence. Our divine guide would not have reduced us to the necessity of walking if he had not intended to carry us in his arms. What need have we of lights and certainties, ideas and reflections? Of what use would it be to us to see, to know, and to feel, when we are no longer walking but being carried in the arms of Divine Providence? The more we have to suffer from darkness, and the more rocks and precipices and deserts there are in our way, the more we have to endure from fears, dryness, weariness of mind, anguish of soul, and even despair, and the sight of purgatory and hell, the greater must be our confidence and faith. One glance at him who carries us is sufficient to restore our courage in the greatest peril. We will forget the paths and what they are like. We will forget ourselves, and abandoning ourselves entirely to the wisdom, goodness, and power of our guide, we will think only of loving him and avoiding all sin, not only that which is evident, however venial it may be, but even the appearance of evil, and of fulfilling all the duties and obligations of our state. This is the only charge you lay upon your children, O divine love. All the rest you take upon yourself. The more terrible this may be, the more surely can your presence be felt and recognized. Your children have only to love you without ceasing, and to fulfill their small duties like children. A child on its mother's lap is occupied only with its games, and if it had nothing else to do but to play with its mother. The soul should soar above the clouds, and as no one can work during the darkness of the night, it is the time for repose. The light of reason can do nothing but deepen the darkness of faith. The radiance necessary to disperse it must proceed from the same source as itself. In this state, God communicates himself to the soul as its life, but he is no longer visible as its way and its truth. The bride seeks the bridegroom during this night. She seeks him before her and hurries forward, but he is behind her and holding her with his hands. He is no longer object or idea, but principle and source. For all the needs, difficulties, troubles, falls, overthrows, persecutions, and uncertainties of souls which have lost all confidence in themselves and their own action, there are secret and inspired resources in the divine action, marvelous and unknown. The more perplexing the circumstances, the keener is the expectation of a satisfactory solution. The heart says, all goes well. It is God who carries on the work. There is nothing to fear. That very suspense and desolation are verses in the Canticle of Darkness. It is a joy that not a single syllable is left out, and it all ends in a Gloria Patri. Therefore we pursue the way of our wanderings, and darkness itself is a light for our guidance, and doubts are our best assurance. The most puzzled Isaac was to find something to sacrifice. The more completely did Abraham place all in the hands of Providence and trust entirely in God. Section 2, Diversity of Grace. The afflictions which the soul is made to endure are but loving artifices of God which will one day give it great joy. Souls that walk in light sing the canticles of the light. Those that walk in darkness sing the songs of the darkness. Both must be allowed to sing to the end part allotted to them by God in the great oratorio. Nothing must be added to the score, nothing left out. Every drop of bitterness must be allowed to flow freely at whatever cost. It was thus with Jeremiah and Ezekiel, whose utterances were broken by tears and sobs, and who could find no consolation except in continuing their lamentations. Had the course of their grief been interrupted, we should have lost the most beautiful passages of Scripture. The spirit that afflicts can also console. These diverse waters flow from the same source. When God appears angry, the soul trembles. When he threatens it, it is terrified. The divine operation must be allowed to develop, for with the evil it carries a remedy. So continue to weep and to tremble. Let restlessness and agony invade your souls. Make no effort to free yourselves from these divine terrors, these heavenly troubles, but open your hearts to receive these little streams from that immense sea of sorrows which God bore in his most holy soul. Sow in sorrow for as long as grace requires, and that same grace will gradually dry your tears. Darkness will disappear before the radiance of the sun. Springtime will come with its flowers, and the result of your abandonment will be seen in the admirable diversity of the divine action. Indeed, it is quite useless for man to trouble himself. All that takes place in him is like a dream. One cloud chases another like imaginations in the brain of the sleeper, some sorrowful, others consoling. The soul is the playground of these phantoms, which follow each other with great rapidity, and on awakening it feels that in all this there is nothing to detain it. When these impressions have passed away, it takes no notice of the joys or sorrows of dreams. O Lord, it can be truly said that you carry your children in your arms during this long night of faith, and that you are pleased to allow an infinite variety of thoughts to pass through their minds, thoughts holy and mysterious. In the state in which these dreams of the night place them, they indeed experience the utmost torment of fear, anguish, and weariness. But on the bright day of eternal glory, these will give place to a true and solid joy. It is at the moment of and just after the awakening that holy souls, returning to themselves and with full right to judge, can never tire of admiring and praising the tact, the inventions, and refinements of loving deception practiced by the divine spouse. They understand how impenetrable are his ways, how impossible it is to guess his enigmas, to find out his disguises, or to receive consolation when it is his will to spread terror and alarm. At this awakening, those who, like Jeremiah and David, have been inconsolable in their grief, will see that in their desolation they have been a subject of joy to the angels and of glory to God. The bride sleeps through the bustle of industries and of human actions, and in spite of the sneers of skeptics. In her sleep she will sigh and tremble. In her dreams she will pursue and seek her spouse, who disguises himself to deceive her. Let her dream. Her fears are only born of the night and of sleep. When the spouse has exercised her beloved soul and shown forth in it what can only be expressed by him, he will develop the result of these dreams and will awaken it at the right time. Joseph caused Benjamin to weep, and his servants kept his secret from his beloved brother. Joseph deceived him, and not all his penetration and wit could fathom this deception. Benjamin and his brothers were plunged in unspeakable sorrow, but Joseph was only playing a trick on them, although the poor brothers could see nothing but an evil without any remedy. When he reveals himself and puts everything right, they admire his wisdom in making them think that all is lost, and to cause them to despair about that which turns out to be a subject of the greatest joy they have ever experienced. Section 3. The generosity of God. The more God seems to despoil the soul that is in the state of abandonment, the more generous are his gifts. Let us continue to advance in the knowledge of the divine action and of its loving deceptions. That which it withdraws from the perception, it bestows incognito, as it were, on the good will. It never allows it to want for anything. It is as if someone who had maintained a friend by bounties bestowed personally upon him should suddenly, for the welfare of the same friend, pretend that he could no longer oblige him, yet continues to assist him without making himself known. The friend, not suspecting any stratagem in this mystery of love, feels hurt and entertains all sorts of ideas and criticisms on the conduct of his benefactor. When, however, the mystery begins to be revealed, God knows what different feelings arise in the soul: joy, tenderness, gratitude, love, confusion, and admiration, followed by an increase of zeal for and attachment to the benefactor. And this trial will be the means of strengthening the soul and accustoming it to similar surprises. The application is easy. With God, the more one seems to lose, the more one gains. The more he strikes off of what is natural, the more he gives of what is supernatural. He is loved at first for his gifts, but when these are no longer perceptible, he is at last loved for himself. It is by the apparent withdrawal of these sensible gifts that he prepares the way for that great gift which is the most precious and the most extensive of all, since it embraces all others. Souls which have once for all submitted themselves to the divine action ought to interpret everything favorably, yes, everything, even the loss of the most excellent directors, and the want of confidence they cannot help feeling in those who offer themselves for that post. In truth, those guides who, of their own accord, run after souls, deserve to be distrusted. Those who are truly inspired by the Spirit of God do not, as a rule, show so much eagerness and self-sufficiency. They do not come forward until they are appealed to, and even then they proceed with caution. May the soul that has given itself entirely to God pass without fear through all these trials without losing its balance. Provided it is faithful to the divine action, this all-powerful action can produce marvels in it in spite of every obstacle. God and the soul work in common, and the success of the work depends entirely on the divine workman, and can only be spoiled if the soul prove unfaithful. When the soul is well, all is well, because what is from God, that is to say, his part and his action, are, as it were, the counterpoise of the fidelity of the soul. It is the best part of the work, which is done something like beautiful tapestry, stitch by stitch, from the wrong side. The worker employed on it sees only the stitch he is making, and the needle with which he makes it, while all the stitches combined form magnificent figures which do not show until, every part being complete, the right side is turned outwards. All the beauty and perfection of the work remain in obscurity during its progress. It is the same with the soul that has abandoned itself to God. It has eyes only for him and for its duty. The performance of this duty is, at each moment, but an imperceptible stitch added to the work. And yet with these stitches God performs wonders of which he sometimes allows a glimpse to be seen, but which will not be visible in their entirety till revealed on the great day of eternity. How full of goodness and wisdom is the guidance of God! He has so entirely kept for his own grace and his own action all that is admirable, great, exalted, and sublime, and so completely left to our souls, with the aid of grace, all that is little, light, and easy, that there is no one in the world who cannot easily reach a most eminent degree of perfection in accomplishing lovingly the most ordinary and obscure duties. Chapter 4, Section 4. The most ordinary things are channels of grace. In the state of abandonment, God guides the soul more safely, the more completely he seems to blind it. It is most especially with regard to souls that abandon themselves entirely to God that the words of St. John are applicable. You have no need that any man teach you, as his unction teacheth you of all things. 1 Ephesians, St. John 2:20. To know what God demands of them, they need only probe their own hearts and listen to the inspirations of this unction, which interpret the will of God according to circumstances. The divine action, concealed though it is, reveals its designs, not through ideas, but intuitively. It shows them to the soul, either necessarily, by not permitting any other thing to be chosen but what is actually present, or else by a sudden impulse, a sort of supernatural feeling that impels the soul to act without premeditation, or, in fine, by some kind of inclination or aversion, which, while leaving it complete liberty, yet nonetheless leads it to take or refuse what is presented to it. If one were to judge by appearances, it seems as if it would be a great want of virtue to be swayed and influenced in this manner. And if one were to judge by ordinary rules, there appears a want of regulation and method in such conduct. But in reality it is the highest degree of virtue, and only after having practiced it for a long time does one succeed. The virtue in this state is pure virtue. It is, in fact, perfection itself. One is like a musician who combines a perfect knowledge of music with technical skill. He would be so full of his art that, without thinking, all that he performed within its compass would be perfect, and if his compositions were examined afterwards, they would be found to be perfect in conformity with prescribed rules. One would then become convinced that he would never succeed better than when free from the rules that keep genius in fetters when too scrupulously followed. He acted without constraint, and that his impromptus would be admired as chef d'oeuvres by all connoisseurs. Thus the soul, trained for a long time in the science and practice of perfection under the influence of reasonings and methods of which it made use to assist grace, forms for itself a habit of acting in all things by the instincts implanted by God. It then knows that it can do nothing better than what first presents itself, without all those arguments of which it had need formerly. The only thing to be done is to act at random when unable to trust in anything but the workings of grace, which cannot mislead it. The effects of grace, visible to watchful eyes and intelligent minds, are nothing short of marvelous. Without method, yet most exact, without rule, yet most orderly, without reflection, yet most profound, without skill, yet thoroughly well constructed, without effort, yet everything accomplished, and without foresight, yet nothing better suited to unexpected events. Spiritual reading with the divine action often contains a meaning that the author never thought of. God makes use of the words and actions of others to infuse truths which might otherwise have remained hidden. If he wishes to impart light in this way, it is for the submissive soul to avail itself of this light. Every expedient of the divine action has an efficacy which also always surpasses its apparent and natural virtue. It is the nature of abandonment always to lead a mysterious life, and to receive great and miraculous gifts from God by means of the most ordinary things that may be natural, accidental, or that seem to happen by chance, and in which there seems no other agency than the ordinary course of the ways of the world or of the elements. In this way, the simplest sermons, the most commonplace conversations, and the least high-toned books become to these souls, by the virtue of God's will, sources of knowledge and wisdom. This is why they carefully gather up the crumbs that skeptics trample underfoot. Everything is precious in their eyes. Everything enriches them. They are inexpressibly indifferent towards all things, and yet neglect nothing, having a respect for and making use of all things. As God is everywhere, the use made of things by his will is not so much the use of creatures as the enjoyment of the divine action which transmits his gifts by different channels. They cannot sanctify of themselves, but only as instruments of the divine action, which has power to communicate his grace, and often does communicate it to simple souls in ways and by means which seem opposed to the end intended. It enlightens through mud as well as through glass, and the instrument of which it makes use is always singular. To it, everything is alike. Faith always believes that nothing is wanting to it, and never complains of the privation of means which might prove useful for its increase, because the workman who employs them efficaciously supplies what is wanting by his action. The divine action is the whole virtue of the creature. For Section 5, Nature and Grace, the instruments of God. The less capable the soul in the state of abandonment is of defending itself, the more powerfully does God defend it. The one and infallible influence of the divine action is invariably applied to the submissive soul at an opportune moment, and this soul corresponds in everything to its interior direction. It is pleased with everything that has taken place, with everything that is happening, and with all that affects it, with the exception of sin. Sometimes the soul acts with full consciousness, sometimes unknowingly, being led only by obscure instincts to say, to do, or to leave certain things, without being able to give a reason for its action. Often the occasion and the determining reason are only of the natural order. The soul, perceiving no sort of mystery therein, acts by pure chance, necessity, or convenience, and its acts have no other aspect either in its own eyes or those of others, while all the time the divine action, through the intellect, the wisdom, or the counsel of friends, makes use of the simplest things in its favor. It makes them its own, and opposes so persistently every effort prejudicial to them that it becomes impossible that these should succeed. To have to deal with a simple soul is, in a certain way, to have to deal with God. What can be done against the will of the Almighty and His inscrutable designs? God takes the cause of the simple soul in hand. It is unnecessary for it to study the intrigues of others, to trouble about their worries, or to scrutinize their conduct. Its spouse relieves it of all these anxieties, and it can repose in Him full of peace and in security. The divine action frees and exempts the soul from all those low and noisy ways so necessary to human prudence. These suited Herod and the Pharisees, but the Magi had only to follow their star in peace. The child has but to rest in his mother's arms. His enemies do more to advance his interests than to hinder his work. The greater efforts they exert to thwart and to make him unawares, the more freely and tranquilly does he act. He never humors them, nor basely truckles to them to make them turn aside their blows. Their jealousies, suspicions, and persecutions are necessary to him. Thus did Jesus Christ live in Judea, and thus does he live now in simple souls. In them he is generous, sweet, free, peaceful, fearless, needing no one, beholding all creatures in his Father's hands, and obliged to serve him, some by their criminal passions, others by their holy actions, the former by their contradictions, the latter by their obedience and submission. The divine action balances all this in a wonderful manner. Nothing is wanting, nor is anything superfluous. But of good and evil there is only what is necessary. The will of God applies at each moment the proper means to the end in view, and the simple soul, instructed by faith, finds everything right and desires neither more nor less than what it has. It ever blesses that divine hand which so well apportions the means and turns every obstacle aside. It receives friends and enemies with the same patient courtesy with which Jesus treated everyone, and as divine instruments. It has need of no one, and yet needs all. The divine action renders all necessary, and all must be received from it, according to their quality and nature, and corresponded to with sweetness and humility. The simple treated simply, and the unpolished kindly. This is what St. Paul teaches, and what Jesus Christ practiced most perfectly. Only grace can impress this supernatural character, which is appropriate to and adapts itself to each person. This is never learnt from books, but from a true prophetic spirit, and is the effect of a special inspiration, and a doctrine of the Holy Spirit. To understand it, one must be in the highest state of abandonment, the most perfect freedom from all design, and from all interest, however holy. One must have in view the only serious business in the world, that of following submissively the divine action. To do this, one must apply oneself to the fulfilling of the obligations of one state, and allow the Holy Spirit to act interiorly without trying to understand his operations, but even being pleased to be kept in ignorance about them. Then one is safe, for all that happens in the world can work nothing but good for souls perfectly submissive to the will of God. Chapter 4, Section 6, Supernatural Prudence. The soul in the state of abandonment does not fear its enemies, but finds in them useful helps. I fear more my own action and that of my friends than that of my enemies. There is no prudence so great as that which offers no resistance to enemies, and which opposes to them only a simple abandonment. This is to run before the wind, and as there is nothing else to be done, to keep quiet and peaceful. There is nothing that is more entirely opposed to worldly prudence than simplicity. It turns aside all schemes without comprehending them, without so much as a thought about them. The divine action makes the soul take such just measures as to surprise those who want to take it by surprise themselves. It profits by all their efforts, and is raised by the very things that are done to lower it. They are the galley slaves who bring the ship into port with hard rowing. All obstacles turn to the good of this soul, and by allowing its enemies a free hand, it obtains a continual service, so sufficing that all it has to fear is lest it should itself take part in a work of which God would be principal, and his enemies the agents, and in which it has nothing to do but to peacefully observe the work of God, and to follow with simplicity the attractions he gives it. The supernatural prudence of the divine spirit, the principle of these attractions, infallibly attains its end, and the precise circumstances of each event are so applied to the soul, without its perception, that everything opposed to them cannot fail to be destroyed. Section 7. Conviction of weakness. The soul in the state of abandonment can abstain from justifying itself by word or deed. The divine action justifies it. This order of the divine will is the solid and firm rock on which the submissive soul reposes, sheltered from change and tempest. It is continually present under the veil of crosses and of the most ordinary actions. Behind this veil the hand of God is hidden to sustain and to support those who abandon themselves entirely to Him. From the time that a soul becomes firmly established in abandonment, it will be protected from the opposition of talkers, for it need not ever say or do anything in self-defense. Since the work is of God, justification must never be sought elsewhere. Its effects and its consequences are justification enough. There is nothing but to let it develop. Dies Dei eructat verbum. Day to day uttereth speech. Psalms 18:3. When one is no longer guided by reflection, words must no longer be used in self-defense. Our words can only express our thoughts. Where no ideas are supposed to exist, words cannot be used. Of what use would they be? To give a satisfactory explanation of our conduct? But we cannot explain that of which we know nothing, for it is hidden in the principle of our actions. And we have experienced nothing but an impression, and that in an ineffable manner. We must therefore let the results justify their principles. All the links of this divine chain remain firm and solid, and the reason of that which precedes as cause is seen in that which follows as effect. It is no longer a life of dreams, a life of imaginations, a life of a multiplicity of words. The soul is no longer occupied with these things, nor nourished and maintained in this way. They are no longer of any avail and afford no support. The soul no longer sees where it is going, nor foresees where it will go. Reflections no longer help it to gain courage to endure fatigue and to sustain the hardships of the way. All this is swept aside by an interior conviction of weakness. The road widens as it advances. It has started and goes on without hesitation. Being perfectly simple and straightforward, it follows the path of God's commandments quietly, relying on God Himself, whom it finds at every step. And God, whom it seeks above all things, takes upon Himself to manifest His presence in such a way as to avenge it on its unjust detractors. Section 8. Self-Guidance, a Mistake. God imparts to the soul in the state of abandonment by means which seem more likely to destroy it. There is a time when God would be the life of the soul and Himself accomplish its perfection in secret and unknown ways. Then all its own ideas, lights, industries, examinations, and reasonings become sources of illusion. After many experiences of the sad consequences of self-guidance, the soul, recognizing its uselessness and finding that God has hidden and confused all the issues, is forced to fly to Him to find life. Then, convinced of its nothingness and of the harmfulness of all that it derives from itself, it abandons itself to God to gain all from Him. It is then that God becomes the source of its life, not by means of ideas, lights, or reflections, for all this is no longer anything to it but a source of illusion, but in reality and by His grace, which is hidden under the strangest appearances. The divine operation, unknown to the soul, communicates its virtues and substance by many circumstances that the soul believes will be its destruction. There is no cure for this ignorance. It must be allowed its course. God gives Himself therein, and with Himself He gives all things in the obscurity of faith. The soul is but a blind subject, or in other words, it is like a sick person who knows nothing of the properties of remedies and tastes only their bitterness. He often imagines that what is given him will be his death. The pain and weakness which result seem to justify his fears. Nevertheless, it is under the semblance of death that his health is restored, and he takes the medicines on the word of the physician. In the same way, the submissive soul is in no way preoccupied about its infirmities, except as regards obvious maladies by which their nature compel it to rest, and to take suitable remedies. The languor and weakness of souls in the state of abandonment are only illusory appearances, which they ought to defy with confidence. God sends them or permits them in order to give opportunities for the exercise of faith and abandonment, which are the true remedies. Without paying the least attention to them, these souls should generally pursue their way, following by their actions and sufferings the order of God, making use without hesitation of the body, as though it were a horse on hire, which is intended to be driven until it is worn out. This is better than thinking of health so much as to harm the soul. A courageous spirit does much to maintain a feeble body, and 1 year of a life spent in so noble and generous a matter is of more value than would be a century of caretaking and nervous fears. One ought to be able to show outwardly that one is in a state of grace and goodwill. What is there to be afraid of in fulfilling the divine will? The conduct of one who is upheld and sustained by it should show nothing exteriorly but what is heroic. The terrifying experiences that have to be encountered are really nothing. They are only sent that life may be adorned with more glorious victories. The divine will involves the soul in troubles of every kind, where human prudence can neither see nor imagine any outlet. It then feels all its weakness, and finding out its shortcomings, is confounded. The divine will then asserts itself in all its power to those who give themselves to it without reserve. It succors them more marvelously than the writers of fiction, in the fertility of their imagination, unravel the intrigues and perils of their imaginary heroes, and bring them to a happy end. With a much more admirable skill, and much more happily, does the divine will guide the soul through deadly perils and monsters, even through the fires of hell with their demons and sufferings. It raises souls to the heights of heaven, and makes them the subjects of histories both real and mystical, more beautiful and more extraordinary than any invented by the vain imagination of man. Oh, then, my soul, through perils and monsters, guided and sustained by that mighty invisible hand of divine providence, on without fear to the end in peace and joy, and make all the incidents of life occasion of fresh victories. We march under his standard, to fight and to conquer. Exivit vincens ut vincere. He went forth conquering that he might conquer. Apocalypse 6:2. As many steps as we take under his command will be the triumphs we gain. The Holy Spirit of God writes in an open book this sacred history which is not yet finished, nor will be till the end of the world. This history contains an account of the guidance and designs of God with regard to men. It remains for us to figure in this history and to continue the thread of it by the union of our actions and sufferings with his will. No, it is not to cause the loss of our souls that we have so much to do and to suffer, but that we may furnish matter for that holy writing which is added to day by day. Section 9, Divine Love, the principle of all good. To those who follow this path, divine love is all-sufficing. While despoiling of all things those souls who give themselves entirely to him, God gives them something in place of them. Instead of light, wisdom, life, and strength, he gives them his love. The divine love in these souls is like a supernatural instinct. In nature, each thing contains that which is suitable to its kind. Each flower has its special beauty, each animal its instinct, and each creature its perfection. Also, in the different states of grace, each has a special grace. This is the recompense for everyone who accepts with good will the state in which he is placed by Providence. A soul comes under the divine action from the moment that a habit of good will is formed within it, and this action influences it more or less according to its degree of abandonment. The whole art of abandonment is simply that of loving, and the divine action is nothing else than the action of divine love. How can it be that these two loves, seeking each other, should do otherwise than unite when they meet? How can the divine love refuse aught to a soul whose every desire it directs? And how can a soul that lives only for him refuse him anything? Love can refuse nothing that love desires, nor desire anything that love refuses. The divine action regards only the good will. The capability of the other faculties does not attract it, nor does the want of capability repel it. All that it requires is a heart that is good, pure, just, simple, submissive, filial, and respectful. It takes possession of such a heart, and of all its faculties, and so arranges everything for its benefit, that it finds in all things its sanctification. That which destroys other souls would find in this soul an antidote of goodwill which would nullify its poison. Even at the edge of a precipice, the divine action would draw it back, or even if it were allowed to remain there, it would prevent it from falling, and if it fell, it would rescue it. After all, the faults of such a soul are only faults of frailty. Love takes but little notice of them, and well knows how to turn them to advantage. It makes the soul understand by secret suggestions what it ought to say, or to do, according to circumstances. These suggestions it receives as rays of light from the divine understanding. Intellectus bonus omnibus facilitatibus eam. A good understanding to all that do it. Psalms 110:10. For this divine understanding accompanies such souls step by step, and prevents them taking those false steps which their simplicity encourages. If they make arrangements which would involve them in some promise prejudicial to them, Divine Providence arranges some fortunate occurrence which rectifies everything. In vain are schemes formed against them repeatedly. Divine Providence cuts all the knots, brings the authors to confusion, and so turns their heads as to make them fall into their own trap. Under its guidance, those souls that they wish to take by surprise do certain things that seem very useless at the time, but that serve afterwards to deliver them from all the troubles into which their uprightness and the malice of their enemies would have plunged them. Oh, what good policy it is to have goodwill! What prudence there is in simplicity! What ability in its innocence and candor! What mysteries and secrets in its straightforwardness! Look at the youthful Tobias. He is but a lad, yet with what confidence he proceeds, having the archangel Raphael for his guide. Nothing frightens him, nothing is wanting to him. The very monsters he encounters furnish him with food and remedies. The one that rushes forward to devour him becomes itself his sustenance. By the order of Providence, he has nothing to attend to but feasts and weddings. Everything else is left to the management of the guiding spirit appointed to help him. These things are so well managed that never before have they been so successful, nor so blessed and prosperous. However, his mother weeps, and is in great distress at his supposed loss. But his father remains full of faith. The son, so bitterly mourned, returns to rejoice his family and to share their happiness. Divine love, then, is to those who give themselves up to it without reserve the principle of all good. To acquire this inestimable treasure, the only thing necessary is greatly to desire it. Yes, God only asks for love, and if you seek this treasure, this kingdom in which God reigns alone, you will find it. If your heart is entirely devoted to God, it is itself, for that very reason, the treasure and the kingdom that you seek and desire. From the time that one desires God and His holy will, one enjoys God and His will, and this enjoyment corresponds to the ardor of the desire. To desire to love God is truly to love Him, and because we love Him, we wish to become instruments of His action, in order that His love may be exercised in and by us. The divine action does not correspond to the aims of a saintly and simple soul, nor to the steps it takes, nor to the projects it forms, nor to the manner in which it reflects, nor to the means it chooses, nor to the purity of its intention. It often happens that the soul can be deceived in all this, but its good intention and uprightness can never deceive it. Provided that God perceives in it a good intention, He can dispense with all the rest, and He holds as done for Him what it will eventually do when truer ideas second its good will. Good will, therefore, has nothing to fear. If it fall, it can only do so under the almighty hand which guides and sustains it in all its wanderings. It is this divine hand which turns it again to face the goal from which it has strayed. which replaces it in the right path when it has wandered. In it the soul finds resources for the deviations to which the blind faculties which deceive it render it subject. It is made to feel how much it ought to despise them, and to rely on God alone, abandoning itself absolutely to His infallible guidance. The failings into which good souls fall are put an end to by abandonment. Never can goodwill be taken unawares. That all things work for its good is an article of faith. Section 10. We must see God in all His creatures. In the state of abandonment, the soul finds more light and strength through submission to the divine action than all those possess who resist it through pride. Of what use are the most sublime illuminations, the most divine revelations, if one has no love for the will of God? It was because of this that Lucifer fell. The ruling of the divine action, revealed to him by God in showing him the mystery of the incarnation, produced in him nothing but envy. On the other hand, a simple soul, enlightened only by faith, can never tire of admiring, praising, and loving the order of God, of finding it not only in holy creatures, but even in the most irregular confusion and disorder. One grain of pure faith will give more light to a simple soul than Lucifer received in his highest intelligence. The devotion of the faithful soul to its obligations, its quiet submission to the intimate promptings of grace, its gentleness and humility towards everyone, are of more value than the most profound insight into mysteries. If one regarded only the divine action in all the pride and harshness of creatures, one would never treat them with anything but sweetness and respect. Their roughness would never disturb the divine order, whatever course it might take. One must only see in it the divine action, given and taken, as long as one is faithful in the practice of sweetness and humility. It is best not to observe their way of proceeding, but always to walk with firm steps in our own path. It is thus that by bending gently, cedars are broken, and rocks overthrown. Who amongst creatures can resist a faithful, gentle, and humble soul? These are the only arms to be taken if we wish to conquer all our enemies. Jesus Christ has placed them in our hands that we may defend ourselves. There is nothing to fear if we know how to use them. We must not be cowardly, but generous. This is the only disposition suitable to the instruments of God. All the works of God are sublime and marvelous, while one's own actions, when they war against God, cannot resist the divine action in one who is united to it by sweetness and humility. Who is Lucifer? He is a pure spirit, and was the most enlightened of all pure spirits, but is now at war with God and with His rule. The mystery of sin is merely the result of this conflict, which manifests itself in every possible way. Lucifer, as much as in him lies, will leave no stone upturned to destroy what God has made and ordered. Wherever he enters, there is the work of God defaced. The more light, science, and capacity a person has, the more he is to be feared if he does not possess a foundation of piety, which consists in being satisfied with God and His will. It is by a well-regulated heart that one is united to the divine action. Without this, everything is purely natural and generally in direct opposition to the divine order. God makes use only of the humble as His instruments. Always contradicted by the proud, He yet makes use of them, like slaves, for the accomplishment of His designs. When I find a soul which does all for God alone, and in submission to His order, however wanting it may be in all things else, I say, this is a soul with a great aptitude for serving God. The Holy Virgin and Saint Joseph were like this. All else without these qualities makes me fear. I am afraid to see in it the action of Lucifer. I remain on my guard and shut myself up in my foundation of simplicity, in opposition to all this outward glitter, which by itself is nothing to me but a bit of broken glass. Section 11. The Strength of Simplicity. The soul in the state of abandonment knows how to see God even in the proud who oppose His action. All creatures, good or evil, reveal Him to it. The whole practice of the simple soul is in the accomplishment of the will of God. This it respects even in those unruly actions by which the proud attempt to depreciate it. The proud soul despises one in whose sight it is as nothing, who beholds only God in it and in all its actions. Often it imagines that the modesty of the simple soul is a mark of appreciation for itself, when all the time it is only a sign of that loving fear of God and of His holy will, as shown to it in the person of the proud. No, poor fool, the simple soul fears you not at all. You excite its compassion. It is answering God when you think it is speaking to you. It is with Him that it believes it has to do. It regards you only as one of His slaves, or rather as a mask with which He disguises Himself. Therefore, the more you take a high tone, the lower you become in its estimation. And when you think to take it by surprise, it surprises you. Your wiles and violence are just favors from heaven. The proud soul cannot comprehend itself, but the simple soul, with the light of faith, can very clearly see through it. The finding of the divine action in all that occurs at each moment, in and around us, is true science, a continuous revelation of truth, and an unceasingly renewed intercourse with God. It is a rejoicing with the spouse, not in secret, nor by stealth, in the cellar or the vineyard, but openly and in public without any human respect. It is a fund of peace, of joy, of love, and of satisfaction with God who is seen, known, or rather believed in, living and operating in the most perfect manner in everything that happens. It is the beginning of eternal happiness, not yet perfectly realized and tasted, except in an incomplete and hidden manner. The Holy Spirit, who arranges all the pieces on the board of life, will, by this fruitful and continual presence of His action, say at the hour of death, Fiat lux, let there be light, Genesis 1:14. And then will be seen the treasures which faith hides in this abyss of peace and contentment with God, and which will be found in those things that have been every moment done or suffered for Him. When God gives Himself thus, all that is common becomes wonderful. And it is on this account that nothing seems to be so, because this way is in itself extraordinary. Consequently, it is unnecessary to make it full of strange and unsuitable marvels. It is in itself a miracle, a revelation, a constant joy even with the prevalence of minor faults. But it is a miracle which, while rendering all common and sensible things wonderful, has nothing in itself that is sensibly marvelous. Section 12. The Triumph of Humility. To the souls which are faithful to Him, God promises a glorious victory over the powers of the world and of hell. If the divine action is hidden here below under the appearance of weakness, it is in order to increase the merit of souls which are faithful to it, but its triumph is none the less certain. The history of the world from the beginning is but the history of the struggle between the powers of the world and of hell against the souls which are humbly devoted to the divine action. In this struggle, all the advantage seems to be on the side of pride, yet the victory always remains with humility. The image of the world is always presented to our eyes as a statue of gold, brass, iron, and clay. This mystery of iniquity, shown in a dream to Nebuchadnezzar, is nothing but a confused medley of all the actions, interior and exterior, of the children of darkness. This is also typified by the beast, coming out of the pit to make war, from the beginning of time, against the interior and spiritual life of man. All that takes place in our days is the consequence of this war. Monster follows monster out of the pit, which swallows and vomits them forth again amidst incessant clouds of smoke. The combat between St. Michael and Lucifer that began in heaven still continues. The heart of this once magnificent angel has become, through envy, an inexhaustible abyss of every kind of evil. He made angel revolt against angel in heaven, and from the creation of the whole world his whole energy is exerted to make more criminals among men to fill the ranks of those who have been swallowed up in the pit. Lucifer is the chief of those who refuse obedience to the Almighty. This mystery of iniquity is the very inversion of the order of God. It is the order, or rather the disorder, of the devil. This disorder is a mystery because under a false appearance of good, It hides irremediable and infinite evil. Every wicked man who, from the time of Cain up to the present moment, has declared war against God, has outwardly been great and powerful, making a great stir in the world, and being worshipped by all. But this outward semblance is a mystery. In reality they are beasts which have ascended from the pit, one after another, to overthrow the order of God. But this order, which is another mystery, has always opposed to them really great and powerful men who have dealt these monsters a mortal wound. As fast as hell vomits them forth, heaven at the same time creates fresh heroes to combat them. Ancient history, sacred and profane, is but a record of this war. The order of God has ever remained victorious, and those who have ranged themselves on the side of God have shared his triumph, and are happy for all eternity. Injustice has never been able to protect deserters. It can reward them only by death, and eternal death. Those who practice iniquity imagine themselves invincible. O God, who can resist you? If a single soul has the whole world, and all hell against it, it need have no fear if, by abandonment, it takes its stand on the side of God and his order. The monstrous spectacle of wickedness armed with so much power, the head of gold, the body of silver, brass, and iron, is nothing more than the image of clay. A small stone cast at it will scatter it to the four winds of heaven. How wonderfully has the Holy Spirit illustrated the centuries of the world! So many startling revelations, so many renowned heroes following each other like so many brilliant stars, so many wonderful events. All this is like the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, forgotten on awakening, however terrible the impression it made at the time. All these monsters only came into the world to exercise the courage of the children of God, and if these are well trained, God gives them the pleasure of slaying the monsters, and sends fresh athletes into the arena. And this life is a spectacle to angels, causing continual joy in heaven, work for saints on earth, and confusion to the devils in hell. So all that is opposed to the order of God renders it only the more to be adored. All workers of iniquity are slaves of justice, and the divine action builds the heavenly Jerusalem on the ruins of Babylon.